From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Also on Tuesday, the Labor Department proposed a rule on the classification of independent contractors. And Alicia, there's been a bit of back and forth on this for years, with one rule getting written and then withdrawn by the next administration. So give us a sense of what the stakes in this are.
So this has become a bigger issue in recent years because of the development of these kinds of platforms like Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, so-called gig economy that allows, workers to, quote unquote, work for these companies, but actually maintain kind of an independent status that they can, drive at whatever times they want. They can work for multiple platforms. They have a lot of flexibility that they wouldn't have if they were, quote unquote, employees. And so the question here is, how do you define an employee under the Fair Labor Standards Act? There are other federal laws where there's a distinction between independent contractor and employee, including the National Labor Relations Act and the IRS, actually also in the Social Security Act. But it's an important distinction because employees under the Federal Labor Standards Act are entitled to overtime and required to be paid the minimum wage. Whereas independent contractors, their pay is generally determined by the contracts. And in terms of these ride-hailing platforms like Uber and Lyft, they pay the drivers, a fare, and then they take a cut of whatever fare that they charge the riders. The issue here is that how do you then try to basically impose a minimum wage and overtime pay on these kind of independent contractors? And again, the gig companies argue that they are using independent contractors, not employees. Because if these were employees, then they would have to be paid the minimum wage for just driving around, even if they're not carrying passengers. They'd have to pay overtime if they're driving more than 40 hours a week. Again, regardless of whether they are ferrying around passengers. And so making these or relabeling these workers or drivers employees would have far-reaching effects on these businesses. But we need to step back and actually consider that, independent contractors, there are about 20 million Americans who work on independent contractors, and most actually don't work on these quote-unquote gig, the gig economy or these platforms. A lot of them, yoga instructors, barbers, consultants, even a lot of lawyers work as independent contractors. And so this new rulemaking that the Labor Department has proposed would basically require most independent contractors to be reclassified as employees. And that includes, by the way, also, humble freelancing newspaper columnists, like many of those who write for opinions for the Journal. And how do you do that is a very, difficult question for companies across the economy. And so just to get into the nitty-gritty details, it would impose an economic realities test, which is to some extent has been embraced by the Supreme Court going back to cases from the 1940s. But just to, speaking of judge-made doctrines, there really is no basis for this in the law. The laws define employees basically as any individual employed by an employer. And so the Supreme Court has basically invented a test of to determine whether someone is an employer or independent contractors using multiple factors. And the Trump administration, amid this confusion among the gig economy companies, said that there are two factors that are most important: the nature and degree of a worker's control and the opportunity for profit. And that helped essentially set a very clear line for these companies and for the courts. Now, the Biden administration is throwing out that rulemaking and saying, well, no, we want to keep a totality of the circumstances analysis that allows the judges to weigh multiple factors, but actually just focus on whether these workers are economically dependent upon an employer for work. And that would probably sweep in most these drivers for Uber and these rideshare companies, the platforms. And so it would be extremely disruptive, and I do imagine it will be challenged in court at the end of the day.
But the argument from the Biden administration here seems to be that businesses have an incentive to shift work from employees to independent contractors because it can be lower cost. They don't have to offer the same kind of benefits. They don't get the same kind of protections under labor law sometimes. They can't unionize. But Kim, the thing that I can't get over is this idea that independent contractors generally set their own work terms, their own timing. They deliver a service, but they choose when and how to do it. And I don't see how it makes sense to put people that are in that situation and push them into the employer bucket if the employer is not really controlling the conditions of their workplace.
Right. It's exceptionally notable that Biden administration is hardly teeming with examples of companies that are forcing people to set their own work schedules and kicking them off the unionized payrolls to become independent contractors. I mean, there may be an example or two of that out there, but for the most part, what's actually been happening here is simply big shifts in the labor market, which, by the way, overall is good. Labor markets that have more flexibility are healthier labor markets. And you look at the crowdsourcing apps that Alicia was referring to, they're remarkably efficient, which is exactly the kind of labor force any thriving economy should seek to have. And it's also been a change in modern society. A lot of these independent contractors, I would note, for instance, are mothers and women who have realized that maybe there's certain hours of the day where they can get something done, but they don't want to show up and work in an office seated at a desk for 10 hours a day or stand on a line and also have to give all of their extra disposable income over in union dues and other things that they don't necessarily prize. So we've had this shift, and the reason we're now having this Biden administration rule is because it's driven by the unions. They're in a panic over the fact that when given a choice, more Americans would prefer to be in control of their own destinies and be in a contract status. That shoves aside unions. They've already been losing members. And the Biden administration, because this is one of their biggest political constituencies, said that, we'll do everything to help unions if you help us get elected. They did. And now their entire agenda has been about paying off big labor. And this is why that rule is in existence.
And Alicia, to the point about Uber, I mean, that is also an interesting thing to think about because to the extent that drivers are economically independent on Uber, can't these drivers switch to Lyft or do DoorDash? I mean, there are all sorts of these apps that are running, and some of them are pretty white collar. I mean, I just opened one of the online freelancing sites this morning and was looking through it, and there's video editing and logo design and translation and all sorts of people who are not doing what you would typically think of as blue collar work, who are getting freelance jobs online and I think making some decent money doing it. And so isn't there also competition in this app sector that helps answer some of the criticisms of it that this is aimed to address? And Alicia, we'll give you the last word on this.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. And that actually competition for labor actually improves quote unquote wages or fares. And you've seen that there's a lot of competition even between Uber and Lyft. Uber probably has about 70% of US market share right now, but Lyft has been trying to compete by raising the fares that it pays and more incentives for drivers. Also, to your point about the flexibility, yes, drivers can toggle around, and not even between Uber and Lyft, they can work for different platforms in terms of, food delivery services or run errands, TaskRabbit. So there's a lot of flexibility that you can essentially be your own, business person. And you can run your own business while also providing services for another company. And this is essentially the essence of an independent contractor. So at the end of the day, the Biden administration is actually really hurting these workers by trying to limit their flexibility and opportunities to receive and earn higher pay. And it's ironic, especially as it mounts a kind of an antitrust crusade against companies. But here it's really its own regulations are intentionally limiting competition in the marketplace.
Thank you, Alicia and Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button. Wall Street Journal members can also join Paul Gigot, Kimberly Strassel, and Karl Rove for a live opinion event, Can Republicans Retake Congress, on Monday, October 17th at 7 p.m. That will be in Dallas or streamed online. And for more information, go to wsjplus.com/opinion live for tickets and more information. And as always, we'll be back here tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.